I'm standing in Palm Cemetery, where those who served Winter Park and Rollins now rest. And perhaps the most unsung person here is Edwin Osgood Grover, who is buried here with his family. Edwin Grover was the first appointment made by Hamilton Holt in 1926, and he came to Rollins as professor of books. But he did much more than that. He, with Hamilton Holt, organized and led and published the animated magazine for its 20 years. He organized the Book a Year program. He was the librarian of Rollins. Eventually he was the vice president of Rollins, attracted many gifts and many wonderful literary collections, including the great Whitman collection. But Edwin Grover was very committed to his church, along with his wife Myrtie, and together they served the community in so many ways. Myrtie recognized the importance of a day nursery for the children of those who worked in Winter Park and organized the Wellbourne Day Nursery. Her husband, Edwin, became the head of the Hannibal Square Associates, and he recognized other needs, beginning with books, and helped organize a book collection in the school. And when his wife, Myrtie, was tragically killed in an automobile accident, he invited his friends and hers, in lieu of flowers, to contribute books to the library in Hannibal Square. And eventually that led to building a library which was named for Myrtie in her memory. And that in turn led to the building of a community center. So Edwin Osgood Grover, having done all of that, recognized the need for elder care and helped organize the fundraising for the Pugh Nursing Home. He became interested in the work of Dr. Mead, and Dr. Mead was the person responsible for cultivating orchids and making orchids so much a part of our lives in America. And he knew that there should be a permanent home for Dr. Mead's collection. So he began to organize neighbors who had land available, and they put together a plot of 47 acres, which we now know as the Mead Botanical Garden. Now, he was not the only Grover who was important to the literary life of Winter Park. His sister, Eulalie, was known by children and their families all over the country. She was the author of the Sunbonnet series, and they sold over 2 million copies to young people who read them with such great joy. And the next generation made important contributions. Here is his daughter Frances, his daughter Hester, who gave her career and life to teaching, their son Graham, who sadly was killed in a train accident very early. These unsung heroes of Winter Park, the Grovers, modestly rest here in Palm Cemetery in Winter Park.
Before becoming a great recruiter and fundraiser for Rollins College, Edwin Osgood Grover had a career as a printer, publisher, poet, and editor. He was born June 4, 1870, in Mantorville, Minnesota, where his father was a Congregational missionary. In 1874, the family moved back to Bethel, Maine, where his father, Nahum Wesley, was a minister in West Bethel. In 1875, the family moved to Topsham, Maine, then Colebrook, New Hampshire, and St. Johnsbury Center, Vermont, where Edwin attended St. Johnsbury Academy. I came to Dartmouth from St. Johnsbury Academy in Vermont, and I spent 4 wonderful years in Hanover. Being the son of a minister in a small Vermont town, I had to work to pay my expenses. I roomed with William Gibbon, a blind student, and read his lessons to him, all except Greek, for the 4 years, at 15 cents an hour. I waited on tables my freshman year at the cheapest student eating club, but by the time I was a senior, I was head waiter at Mrs. Murphy's exclusive boarding house, the old Daniel Webster House. I was also an agent for a laundry company, and I took care of President Bartlett's furnace. Every summer, I reported for the Boston Globe in the White Mountains resort hotels. I played on the freshman football team and was on the track team for 4 years, but I broke no records. I was on the junior yearbook and editor-in-chief of the Dartmouth Literary Monthly my senior year. Grover was a member of Phi Delta Theta and a fraternity brother of his roommate William Gibbon. Grover was valued for his elegant verse and equally good prose. He wrote, "I didn't miss a thing, and I had a wonderful time." After graduation, I went to Harvard to get my master's degree in English, but I soon found out that the professors with whom I hoped to study were on leave of absence or ill. After a month, I withdrew, obtained a refund, and decided to see all the world I could on $300. Steerage passage over cost $10, and the return was $9.60. The $300 lasted 8 months, and it took me from the Shetland Islands to Scotland, England, France, and the Sahara Desert in Algeria. My return trip included Italy, Switzerland, England, and Holland. When I reached home at last, I had the sum of 25 cents in my pocket, but what memories! Returning from his travels, he went to work as a salesman for Ginn and Company, textbook publishers, later Ginn and Heath. Murdy Laura Graham was born in Colebrook, New Hampshire, attended St. Johnsbury Academy in Vermont, and graduated from Mount Holyoke in 1893. She spent 3 years at the Hartford Theological Seminary and then worked for the American Missionary Association, teaching Latin and literature at Tillotson College in Austin, Texas. Tillotson was an African-American college. After a year, she was transferred to Savannah, Georgia, where she was principal of the Beach Institute, also an African-American school. She spent the summers in New England and married Edwin Grover in 1900. They had known each other since childhood. The Grovers had their first daughter, Frances, in Highland Park, Illinois, in 1904. He then went to work for Rand McNally and soon became president of Prang Company, which specialized in painting materials and books. His sister, Eulalie, had become a household name because of her children's textbooks, The Sunbonnet Babies and The Overall Boys.
Osgood Grover came to the college at a very critical moment in its history. He remained a long time and was one of the most important faculty at this college for many, many years. He came at a time when the college was really at a critical point because it had emerged from World War I, barely struggling along since it had lost a lot of male students. And so, as a kind of desperate effort to save it and give it one more chance of existence, because it had been here since 1885, the trustees hired a man named Hamilton Holt, who was a very prominent figure in the United States at the time, who most importantly was a former editor of the Independent magazine, which at the turn of the century and in the first decades of the 20th century was probably one of the most important magazines, most influential magazines in the United States. Holt had left the Independent. During the time he was editor of the Independent, they ran a whole series of articles on what was happening in higher education at the time, and Holt picked up some really good ideas about, or different ideas at least, about how American education could change and needed to change, especially in the classroom. From his experience at Yale, where there was a recitation system, where mostly the professor lectured and the students memorized huge sections of books and then would try to repeat them in class. Holt thought this was really a very poor way to teach.
I arrived in Winter Park in September 1926. Since I was the first man to be employed by Hamilton Holt, as well as the first professor of books, the publicity department of the college arranged speaking dates for me from Jacksonville to Miami. Following one of these talks on the romance of the book at the Orlando Cirrhosis Club, a group came to the front to examine my display of materials. One interested woman remarked that she wished her son was at Rollins to get my courses on the romance of the book, literary personalities, and recreational reading. She explained, further, that the boy had already begun to collect old books, but unfortunately, he had just enrolled as a freshman at Washington and Lee University. When the son returned at Christmas time, his father brought him to Dean Carruthers' office to ask if he might transfer in January from Washington and Lee to Rollins College without waiting until the following September. 10 years later, when Dr. Carruthers paid a visit to Rollins, he remarked that the best thing he ever did for Rollins was to say yes. The young man who transferred to Rollins in 1926 is now known as Dr. Hugh Ferguson McCain, the first Rollins alumnus to become president of Rollins College. Grover was a highly sought-after speaker throughout Florida and Georgia. He was able to raise the profile of Rollins and to recruit students, particularly during the Depression and World War II. No easy task.
Holt was looking for what he later was to call golden personalities, teachers who could really make a great contribution to the classroom. And Grover was Holt's first golden personality. He was eminently successful in those courses. Grover was just as important because he became a very, very close confidant of Holt. And he bought into Holt's curriculum almost immediately. In fact, one of the things he did was to have an oval table constructed for his classroom, which would place the students not in these rows that most classrooms had, but in a way in which there was a kind of ability to converse.
Grover was the product of a very different time, a time when faculty members could be characters and could be something other than the kind of professionals that now tend to inhabit the academic world. He was enormously popular with the students. While he was at Rollins, he had lots of other careers. He was librarian, he was a vice president. He was also a major contributor to Winter Park. He was a seminal figure in developing much of what we now think of as the essential character of Winter Park. And he lived, of course, in this wonderful house close to campus, so he could stroll to campus and invite students over to his house. Probably the thing that I identify with most in his career was the way he cultivated other writers and students. He did an enormous amount of work and devoted an extraordinary amount of energy to encouraging young writers to publish, to recognize that if they wanted to be serious about their writing, they had to present it to others and think of their writing not as something they were doing for themselves, but as something that they were doing for an audience. He started the Angel Alley Press, and the Angel Alley Press he claimed to have been based on an Angel Alley Press in London, founded by James Grover, whom he claimed was a relative. There apparently isn't much evidence that he was a relative, but the Angel Alley Press lasted for a number of years, published a couple of very important figures. The Angel Alley Press had disappeared, and Grover thought that would be a great title for all sorts of reasons to use to introduce people to literature, especially poetry. Poetry was his great passion.
One of Grover's accomplishments, together with Hamilton Holt, is what is called the animated magazine.
I'm sitting on the porch of Pinehurst Cottage, the last remaining original building of Rollins College, and perhaps that's an appropriate place to be talking about the animated magazine. If you were to think of Rollins in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, of course you'd think of Hamilton Holt and his conference plan. But you'd probably think about the animated magazine, which became a national institution because Hamilton Holt's friends, and he had so many, really enjoyed coming to Winter Park in February and being part of his outdoor magazine where, as he said, the authors didn't write their stories, they spoke them. It goes back to the fact that after Edwin Grover was appointed to Rollins, he was another publisher. One day Hamilton Holt called him in and said, "You know, I'm thinking about publishing a magazine." And Grover said, "Well, we spent our life publishing, now we're in education." And Hamilton Holt said, "Well, I don't mean a printed magazine. I mean one where the authors speak their articles and stories." And Edwin Grover said, "Oh, you mean an animated magazine?" And they always told the story that that's how the name developed. It began in 1927, and world figures would come to Winter Park, come in by train and stay at the local hotels. There was a convocation where several would receive honorary degrees, and then they would speak their articles to an audience that began as just a few thousand, but one year got over 5,000 people who came to this campus and spoke from the stage that was set up in the Sandspur field.
Time Magazine, March 4th, 1929. Rollins College in Winter Park, Florida, is that state's oldest educational institute. Last week, it celebrated its 44th anniversary. At Rollins, literature is stressed nowadays. Holt presided, assisted by Edwin Osgood Grover, professor of books. None of the reading poets were Rollins alumni. There was an alumni reunion and kudos. Presiding over the reunion was alumnus Rex Beach. President Holt, one-time editor, still looks more like a newspaperman than a college president. He is energetic, sometimes embarrassingly outspoken.
In the very last edition, which Hamilton Holt and Edwin Osgood Grover published themselves, this was in 1949, he says, "We thank you. This is the last issue of the Rollins Animated Magazine, with which the undersigned will be associated as editor and publisher. In closing our 22 years of pleasant association, we wish to thank the more than 100 famous contributors who have adorned the pages of the only magazine in the world that comes alive, the animated magazine."
He published in 1929 the Rollins Book of Verse. That was an extraordinarily important book. It was edited by Jessie Rittenhouse, who is a very important figure in American poetry. She had founded the Poetry Society of America and she had received the Poetry Society's first Robert Frost Medal. Jessie Rittenhouse was very close to Rollins, and she brought together a number of Florida writers. It was really the first time someone wanted to make the statement that Florida had an important literary tradition.
In May 1932, the Depression did away with money for research so far as I was concerned. So I took my nerve in my hand and decided to try to write a story I had been carrying around with me. Back in my native village, I wrote first, Mules and Men. That is, I edited the huge mass of material I had, arranged it in some sequence, and laid it aside. It was published after my first novel.
It's Grover's ability to connect Hurston with Robert Winch that really becomes really important to transforming her relationship and her sojourn back home to Edenville. If you look at the relationship between Zora Neale Hurston and Rollins College, her first introduction is with Grover. She actually wanders into the Bookery, which is a bookstore he helped found. But then very quickly, she asks him about helping her develop her idea of this sort of traditional folk theater. This is something Hurston had been talking about and reading about and working on really for many years. So she connects with Grover, Grover connects her with Winch, and it's with Winch that really Hurston does the sort of seminal work that will be very important to cementing her historic relationship with Rollins College. It's working with Robert Winch and developing the two plays that really cement her relationship with Rollins. And what attracts Grover and the rest of the faculty is her ability to sort of articulate those ideas about African American sort of self and agency that many progressives of the era thought were very important. This is something that Grover himself believed in and supported through institutional action and through sort of personal dedication. Grover had been a strong supporter of the Hannibal Square community, which is an African American community here in Winter Park. Hamilton Holt himself had a long and established career as a progressive and was one of the founding members of the NAACP.
In addition to Hannibal Square, Edwin Grover, together with Jack Coonnery, got involved in creating a 47-acre botanical garden dedicated to the memory of Theodore Mead. Mead left all his orchids and other tropical plants to Jack Coonnery, who was a Boy Scout under Mead. Coonnery had been dreaming of a botanical garden for years. Grover's background as a country boy and his interest in the American craftsman movement always drew him to nature and to improving his environment, be it books, paintings, buildings, or gardens. It started on Bible Hill, where Grover spent summers, some 5 miles north of St. Johnsbury, Vermont. Years later, he wrote a poem about the summers on Bible Hill. He was an avid horticulturist, and we have several pictures of him tending to his plants, usually in a well-tailored suit. As a college student at Dartmouth, he was involved in the creation of the Bartlett Tower and Park that signified the lone pine that had stood over the Dartmouth Green for 150 years. When Edwin and Myrtie got married in 1900, everybody who could went to the Paris Exposition. Instead, the newlyweds went camping in the woods of Maine and spent a few weeks in Boothbay Harbor, where they discovered a former ice pond that they later bought and called Appalachie Lake. At the turn of the 19th century, in part as a reaction to the pollution and exploitation created by the Industrial Revolution, garden planning had become a mainstream movement. Famous designers, such as Olmsted, were instrumental in designing gardens and parks for the general public, such as the Midway Pleasance of the Chicago Columbian Exhibition and Central Park in New York City. The idea was to create a soothing, natural environment with brooks and lakes, rustic paths and trails that would provide citizens with an easily accessible oasis of tranquility. Edwin's brother Frederick was professor of botany at Oberlin College in Ohio. In 1927, he was visiting Winter Park for a family get-together. One of the first things Frederick said when he got there was that he wanted to meet the famous Dr. Mead. Theodore Luquier Mead was a well-known biologist and botanist. In 1886, Mead bought 86 acres in Oviedo and spent the rest of his life on his plantation, wait a bit, hybridizing orchids and growing a wide range of subtropical plants and oranges. He was one of the most successful hybridizers of orchids. In contrast to Luther Burbank, he never added his name to any of the new species he worked with. Like Grover, he was modest about his accomplishments. We can see Edwin and Frederick going across the street to the Dinky Dock Railroad Station in Winter Park and taking the train to Oviedo. From the Oviedo station, they wandered on down Geneva Drive, then left on Lake Charm Drive until they reached Mead's plantation, Wait a Bit, with its beautiful view of Lake Charm. Frederick Grover and Theodore Mead were kindred spirits, in that Frederick is reputed to have been the first college professor in the United States to teach Darwin's theory of evolution. Mead was very much a proponent of evolution. While Grover had been looking into developing a botanical garden for Rollins and had talked both with Mead and Nerling, nothing came of it until 1936, after Mead's death, when Jack Coonnery, a Rollins student, came to see the professor to talk about what to do with Mead's plants. Theodore Mead also was a Boy Scout leader in Oviedo. When Dr. Mead and his scouts went camping at Silver Lake Campground, they ran into Jack Coonnery, an Orlando Eagle Scout also at camp. Jack was the youngest Eagle Scout on record. He had accompanied the deep-sea diving naturalist William Beebe on one of his expeditions to Bermuda as a photographer. In 1934, while at Rollins, Jack married a classmate from Ohio, Helen Galloway. Jack and Helen lived near the Dinky Railroad tracks on Lake Virginia, adjacent to what is now Mead Garden. When Mead died, he gave all his flowers, palms, and other plants to Jack Coonnery. Grover himself grew orchids and bromeliads. There is a story that John Coonnery and Grover went over to Maitland Avenue, what is now South Denning Drive. According to the Orlando Sentinel, on June 2, 1962, only the evening stirring of the egrets and herons gave notice that a lake was in the middle of the swampland between Pennsylvania Avenue and Maitland Avenues. It was difficult to see much, since the properties were largely overgrown. Grover, now 67, reportedly took Jack Coonnery on his shoulders so they could better scout out the garden, and in fact were able to see what is now Lake Lillian. In order to put together enough land, Coonnery and Grover first approached Senator Walter Rose, the developer of Orwin Manor. Rose owned several lots along Maitland Avenue. He had planned to develop the area, but with the Great Depression still weighing heavily on the economy, it was unlikely that much building would occur. Rose donated 23 acres, with the stipulation that it would revert to the seller unless it was used for a botanical garden. Winter Park Mayor James A. Treat, also a developer, donated some acres, and so did Mr. and Mrs. R.F. Leedy. Mr. Leedy owned various businesses in Winter Park, most prominently Leedy's, on the first floor of the Hamilton Hotel, now the Park Plaza. Mayor Treat was mayor on a number of occasions. His most visible development was what is now the historic district known as the College Quarter. The one mystery donor was Mary Elizabeth Bartles. She donated some 20 acres, presumably to satisfy a tax lien. Mary and Mayor Treat were the only donors not present at the groundbreaking. The city of Orlando donated a clay pit, and the city of Winter Park donated an unused parcel of property. None of these transactions proceeded smoothly. In a letter dated just 6 months before the opening of the garden, Edwin Grover wrote to Walter Schultz, city clerk, asking for assistance in completing the deeds of Mr. Rose and Mayor Treat's property to the city. Grover writes, "If we can get the Rose and Treat deeds straightened out, and the handful of critics will let us alone, the garden will have an opportunity to develop the way it should." In 1937, Coonnery and Grover organized a nonprofit corporation, Theodore L. Mead Botanical Garden, Incorporated, and applied for a grant from the WPA to provide funds to drain some of the land, clear the brush, and build trails. Some $62,000 were received that provided work for many unemployed Winter Park residents 3 days a week. Grover donated a greenhouse, and several more greenhouses were built. Robert Okeechobee Mitchell, the stepson of Dr. Nerling in Gotha, Florida, became the first landscape architect of Mead Garden. Dr. Nerling was friends with Dr. Mead and Edwin Grover. Bob Mitchell had attended the Rollins Academy, then graduated from Washington University in St. Louis, and worked at the Missouri Botanical Garden before coming to Mead. Germany, under Hitler, was feverishly preparing to go to war. But even before Mead Garden opened, Grover and Coonnery pulled a publicity stunt, the tulip caper. In 1938, Grover wrote to Mrs. Sprague Smith, the founder of the Bach Festival Orchestra, that he had secured 10,000 bulbs of tulips for the garden. The bulbs had been frozen in Holland so they would bloom in February 1939, and for 1 year, Mead Garden had a flowering tulip bed right in front where the Winter Park Garden Club building stands now. Apparently, it was a great success that year, but the bulbs would have had to be dug up and refrigerated during the winter for another planting. The tulips did not really fit into the master plan of predominantly native plants with limited areas of ornamentals. Also, second-year tulip bloom is only about 65%. We have a photograph of the groundbreaking of the garden on January 8, 1938. It shows S.Y. Way, Mayor of Orlando, Robert Bruce Barber, Carl Jackson, Chairman County Commission, U.S. Senator Charles O. Andrews, Edwin Grover, R.C. Leedy, T.K. Apgar, Division Head of the WPA, John H. Coonnery, A.J. Thompson, Orange County WPA official, James A. Moody, Mayor of Winter Park, Gene Kinsey, Girl Scout. In a similar group shot published in the Orlando Sentinel, January 9, 1938, Mr. Barber is absent, but Senator Rose stands between Mr. Jackson and Dr. Grover. Mead Garden officially opened January 14, 1940, with great fanfare. City and college dignitaries and Senator Andrews attended. Dr. Louis Knudsen from Cornell University gave a lengthy and erudite address on the merits of hybridization and on Dr. Mead's contribution. Hamilton Holt talked. There was a large crowd, and the expectation was that Mead Garden would become a major tourist attraction in Central Florida, one of the first Central Florida theme parks. Unfortunately, World War II intervened, and attendance started to lag, even though admission was just a quarter. Dr. James Talbert is a retired university administrator who grew up in Hannibal Square, starting in 1936 and during the World War II years. His father worked for Dr. Grover at Mead Garden.
And he was a caretaker. He did the caring for the grounds and the plantings and fertilizing and all the other kinds of things that had to be done at Mead's Botanical Garden. During that time, the emphasis was on orchids. And they grew a lot of orchids during that time, and they would have orchid shows. And I can remember as a child, my father would have to go back in the evenings to work at the orchid shows, and they would have refreshments. And all the refreshments that were left, they gave them to my father, and he could bring them home. So we would be waiting up for the refreshments, and he would bring the cookies and whatever kinds of things that were left. Dr. Grover was responsible for my father purchasing the land on Capon Avenue, where our home exists today. He helped him purchase that property and helped him build the house that's there now. Our home has been there, I think, since 1940. I can remember walking to the Mead's Garden down Pennsylvania Avenue and going in and walking around, visiting with my father. They didn't care about that. They didn't mind it. And they had a lot of man-made lakes Mead's garden. And my friends and I, we would stand out and look at the turtles and all the different animals in those man-made lakes and all the shrubbery around the lakes and the greenhouses. I think that's the first time I'd ever heard of a greenhouse. I maybe was about 8 or 9 years old, but I knew they grew plants in there. And the man that was in charge there was, one thing I remember, his name was Jess. And they called him Mr. Jess, and he lived on Colonial Drive. And my father would take him home in the truck after work, and then he would come home himself.
During the World War II years, Jack Coonnery worked as a superintendent at Mead, and Helen had a job as a librarian at Rollins College. Times were tough, and pay was minimal. After Helen's hospitalization for pneumonia and malnutrition, Dr. Brown Landone, a widely known physician with a large cult-like following who lived on Lake Virginia, offered Helen a position as a secretary at his farm in Zellwood. Brown Landone was growing rami, a plant that provides unusually tough fibers for ropes and protective gear. After World War II, Mead Garden could not afford a living wage for Jack and his family. The Coonnerys moved to West Palm Beach, where Jack was superintendent of a rami factory in Belglade. I suspect that Brown Landone assisted in getting him the job in South Florida. There is a memo from Edwin Grover to Hamilton Holt describing Grover's visit to Belglade and the Coonnerys and how impressed he was with the operation. On September 19, 1947, a Category 4 hurricane wiped out the factory in Belglade and the plantation. The rami plantation did not recover until the early 1950s. An invitation from the Cuban Secretary of Education, Jose Aleman, moved the Coonnerys to Cuba. Unfortunately, the secretary died 2 years after the Coonnerys arrived, and they were out of a job. While working for Aleman, Jack visited the King Ranch in Texas and purchased Santa Gertrudis cattle for breeding in Cuba. The Coonnerys returned to DeLand to be near family. Helen started an African violet business, Mimi's African Violets, which became very successful selling violets to large chain retailers. Her largest customer was F.W. Woolworth's. The Coonnerys remained engaged at Mead Garden after their return from Cuba. We have to thank Edwin Grover, Jack, and Helen Coonnery for their continued support of Mead Garden. Without them, the garden would not exist today. In 1956, a Grover Trail was dedicated to mark Edwin's contribution to the existence and persistence of Mead Garden.
Dr. Grover did have 2 tragedies in his life. The first was the death of his wife, Myrtie Grover, and she was hit by a car in front of their home and was killed. This was part, I'm sure, of what moved them over to Camellia Avenue from downtown Winter Park. And I know that had to be a very difficult time for him. Then his son, Graham Grover, it was said that he committed suicide by stepping in front of a train. Whether or not that's true, I'm not sure. So there were 2 real tragedies that happened to him in his life.
When I came out of school, I actually taught at Wellbourne the 4- and 5-year-olds under Miss Christine Barrington. And I was sent there to see what we could do as a class to help. And as a result of that, I'm still there. And my children went to Wellbourne, and it was a grassroots place for grassroots education for all of the most of 90% of the African Americans that are here.
Grover's had an interest in children of all ages, and of course he was professor of books, and it interested me to learn that they had set up a cabinet in the school and collected books to
For the library.
have books available for children and their families. And when Murdy Grover sadly died in an accident, he asked people, instead of flowers, give books. And the result of that was the development of the library here in Hannibal Square. And Edwin Grover was always proud to reflect that this is the library that grew from flowers.
I think Mr. Grover would be proud that Wellbourne is still surviving. We're celebrating 87 years of service to the community. We have a new facility now, and it was done through a block grant back in the 90s. Education is very important, and I think we have to start with our young. If we don't capture them there, they're sort of lost. So,
Do you have recollections of the library?
yes, I do, and I remember going there because that was the only library other than the one at Hungerford that we could go to. And of course, there were days when we had to go and get books and study, and our parents was really firm and stern about education, so it was always part of our lives.
Edwin Osgood Grover grew up as a minister's son and really spent his life going to Sunday school and soon teaching Sunday school. Education is so much a part of the congregational tradition. So when he went to the world of work, it's probably no surprise that all his work somehow involved education. He worked so hard to develop the idea of learning about books. He got artifacts, he got materials so that students could see what it was like to read from papyrus, what it was like to read Babylonic cuneiform. And he, being a thoughtful person, once wrote this wonderful recipe for education, an expression of how much he cared about education and doing justice to his responsibility as professor of books. And of course, as professor of books, it was not long before Hamilton Holt asked him to be the director of our library. And it's such a joy today to be sitting with the current Olin Library right over my shoulder to remind me that Edwin Osgood Grover was not only the great teacher we all know about, but he knew that the book was essential to learning at Rollins.
I met Dr. Grover on a bus stop. I was going to find out how I could get into Rollins College in 1950. He was just leaving his home, going to the college, and it was fortunate that I was sitting on that bench and he was sitting on that bench also, and we began a conversation. And I said I wanted to go to Rollins College, and I didn't know how I could get there. I didn't have any finances to do it, and of course, you know, being the helpful, sharing soul that he was, his hands and his heart leaped out to me. And he says, I have just retired from vice presidency of Rollins College, and I've been long in touch with it. And maybe I can help you if I remember all of that. And he did help me. We got on the bus. We went to Winter Park to Rollins, and he took me up to visit the director of admissions, Dr. Jack Rich, and I was interviewed, and that started my career at Rollins, and I was accepted. I got to meet his family, his two sisters and his daughter, Frances, a delightful family. He introduced me to Dr. O'Brien at O'Brien's drugstore, and he got me a job, and I was able to work my first year on the campus. I worked 40 hours a week, and I got a scholarship, and Rollins at that time was an expensive school, so I did need to work and I did need some help. He began to identify me with what he was doing as a young person after he became in his years of business. I told him that I was working in the Sunday school. I was a teacher and Sunday school superintendent. That seemed to hit another note with him because in his early life, he was very strong with working with youth in the church. The Fessett organization that he helped establish, and then I told him I was active in the Boy Scouts, and that identified the Fessett organization with them, and how we hiked with them, and how they raised money to benefit the community, and that's what I was doing with my Boy Scouts in the Santa Rosa area, and I became a scoutmaster. Winter Park in the early 50s was very much fun. The cab stand around the corner from the drugstore, and the cab drivers that would come in, Hugh McCain to get a cup of coffee, and then we go right next door to get a haircut where the barbers were. It was, and the symphony goers would come in for coffee after the symphony finished at about 9:30.
In his later years, Edwin Grover's health began to fail. On February 6, 1959, he was 89. He wrote to Dave Berto, "Father Time has suddenly begun to pick on us, and we have been spending most of our time in the Winter Park Hospital or taking pills prescribed by physicians for half a dozen diseases and ailments." After mentioning that his sister Eulalie had died December 18, 1958, and that his sister Anne had been seriously ill, he continues, "Worst of all, I am losing the sight in my eyes as far as reading is concerned, and you can imagine what life without books means to me." He was giving away his library to Rollins, the University of Jacksonville, and the Orlando Junior College, now Lake Highland Preparatory School.
And one of his little talks was the business of making good. And he would refer to the best business of all is the business of making good. It's not the business of being a doctor, or it's not the business of being a tool and die maker or a salesman or a publisher, but it's the business of making good. And I know he wanted that to permeate into boys' thinking, whether even if it was in the schoolroom, the business of making good.
March 31st, 1960. Dear Dave, here I am again with more debris from my letter files. If the material is of any use to you during the next 50 years, I shall be very glad. You seem to be following in my footsteps as salesman, Sunday school superintendent, and printer's devil. If you get as much fun out of your work as I have, you'll be a very lucky man.
This just represented what happened to an outstanding family. I would stand at the end of their cemetery plots and look at it and think, there are so many people who should be here putting flowers on these people's graves because of what they did. Murdy worked so hard at Hannibal Square. Dr. Grover picked up that work, establishing a library to help the African Americans in Winter Park so that they had an opportunity. Dr. Grover promoted African American authors, giving them an opportunity that they would never have had otherwise. If everybody that Miss Frances, Miss Eulalie, Dr. Grover, and Murdy Grover helped would come here and put one flower down, we would have 10 feet of flowers sitting here for just each person, because that was the life that they lived. They lived selfless lives.
Edwin Osgood Grover lived a long and full and productive life of service. He died at 95. His service was on November 11th, Armistice Day, and how appropriate, because he, with Hamilton Holt, dedicated the Peace Monument on the Rollins campus on the 20th anniversary of the armistice. And so on November 11th, the college and community gathered to bid farewell to that man who had given them so much. The eulogy concluded with a quotation from a favorite poem he had written. And it's an expression really of his life and all that he contributed to our lives. Shall I tell you the secret of all I have learned in life's journey of doing and daring? Happiness comes and happiness stays in sharing and sharing and sharing.
I too have heard the insistent call of bird and wind and sun. I too have heard the little brooks low calling as they run. I too have heard the summons far of seagulls in the rain. And lo, my heart is home once more, here on the coast of Maine.